My name is Andrea Rounds, and I'm the director of the Whitman Public Library. And we are here for an afternoon with Barbara Shapiro, the author of The Art Forger and the Muralist. This is our third Whitman Reads program, and we're very happy with the turnout today. The program has gone over very well, and I'm so happy to see people so engaged in this process. The support of literature throughout our lives is something crucial to the library, so we really like to see people getting involved. So I'm so happy that you're here today to support our program. I'd like to give a special thank you to the Friends of the Whitman Public Library for staffing the book sale table and the raffle table, and for just really helping us throughout our process and the work that they do every day. So thank you very much, the Friends. Really, thank you. So today we're going to have a discussion and then a little bit of a question and answer period. B.A. Shapiro is the author of 7 novels. Are you working on your last novel now? Yes. Including the New York Times bestseller, The Art Forger, which we're here to discuss, and most recently, The Muralist, which we do have on sale. She's also written 4 screenplays and a nonfiction book, The Big Squeeze. She has taught sociology at Tufts University and creative writing at Northeastern University. Barbara lives in Boston with her husband, Dan, and their dog, Sagan? Sagan. Excellent. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Hi. This is great. Thank you all for coming, and thanks. Like, a town is reading my book. I mean, this is like so cool. You heard that I have published 7 novels. What you didn't hear is that the first 5 nobody read. They came out and they died. They were all psychological suspense, and they were all, you know what, this will move. No, will it move? No, I guess not. Okay. So they were all psychological suspense, and they were published by major publishers, HarperCollins and Avon Books, but nobody promoted them, so nobody read them. And I thought, well, maybe I should write a book in a different genre. So I like contemporary women's fiction, and I figured, okay, I'll write a book that's contemporary women's fiction. And I did, and it was a pretty good book. So I gave it to my agent, and my agent didn't like it. So I got another agent. And this agent took it to all the major publishers in New York, and every single one of them agreed with the first agent. So then I thought, well, how about I'll write a book that's half psychological suspense and half women's fiction? Good idea. Wrote the book. Each one of these books took between 2 and 3 years to write. And I thought this one was really quite good. So I gave it to my agent. He didn't like it very much. So I got another agent. And this agent took that book to all of the big publishers in New York, and every single one of them turned it down. So writing is my 5th career, depending on how you want to count them, and I could have gone back to any of the other ones. I could have come up with something new, but no, this didn't even occur to me. I thought, well, what is it that people like to read? Well, people love to read thrillers, right? So I'll write a thriller. Of course, I had no idea how to write a thriller. So what I did is I went to my local library and I found a book. I don't know if you have it here, but it's an actual book, and it's called How to Write the Blockbuster Novel. And in this book, he says there are 6 things that you need to do to write the blockbuster novel. One of them is that the stakes have to be huge, and the protagonist has to be bigger than life, and it's all on this international palette. And so I took very careful notes, and I wrote a book that had all 6 of these things over and over and over again. And I'm here to tell you it's a really good book. It was a really good book then, and it still is a really good book. So I was very excited to bring it to my agent. And fortunately, she didn't like it. I got another agent. It got turned down. So now I have 5 books that were born but died in infancy. And I now have 3 more that haven't even been born. And it finally dawns on me, maybe I should come up with a new career. I didn't want to do this. All I wanted to do was write. But you know, sometimes you got to know when to quit. So I came up with an idea after I mourned for a while, and I was discussing it with my husband one night. And he looks at me and he says, "You don't want to do that. All you want to do is write a novel," which I did. He said, you know, so write a novel. I do a lot of teaching, and I teach writers a lot. And I know you've all heard the adage that what a writer needs is a room of her own. Well, I have a room of my own. I love my room of my own. But what a writer really needs is a working spouse with benefits. And here, my working spouse with benefits is telling me to write another novel. So I'm like, cool, I won't do that job. I'll just write another novel. And then he says, why don't you forget about the genre stuff? Why don't you write the novel of your heart? And I'm like, cool. I don't have to do this job. I can write another novel. It can be the novel of my heart. This is all going to be great. Except, what is the novel of my heart? I had no idea. But fortunately, and I think if you've heard other novelists speak, they may have mentioned something like this too. I have a file that is very helpful. And it is very cleverly named Novel Ideas. And in this very cleverly named file, I have photographs and postcards and magazine articles and newspaper clippings and notes on napkins about all the things that I thought I would like to write a book about someday. And one of the first things that was in the file was an article about Isabella Stewart Gardner. And I had been living in Boston for many years, had never really encountered her much until I was writing my first novel that got published. And it took place in the Back Bay in the late 19th century. And I was just fascinated by this person who was like breaking down all of these barriers and just doing what she wanted. And so I thought, oh yeah, I could write a novel about Belle. And so I assume you all know pretty much all about Belle and her museum. And she was really a feminist before the word was even coined. It's interesting, in that time, the wealthier you were as a woman, the more conscribed your life was. They had so many rules for these people, what you could do, how you could do it, where you could go, what you would wear, really excruciating. And so Belle, who grew up in New York in quite a wealthy family, moved up to Boston to marry one of the wealthiest guys in Boston, John Gardner. And she looked around and she's like, hell no, I'm not gonna live like this. And she did actually walk Lion Clubs down Boylston Street. That is all true. She did go to the symphony with a headband that said, "OU Red Sox." And she did become the first great American art collector, man or woman. And so she and John went around the world, and they were primarily focused on Europe, but they also went to Asia. She was interested in not only paintings, but sculpture and furniture and rugs and all kinds of things. And they had a big townhouse on Beacon Street. And within a few years, it was completely filled up. There are pictures that, now we would definitely say she was a hoarder. But I mean, you could not walk anywhere. So what they did is they bought the house next door, another big 5-story huge mansion, and they broke down the walls between them, and then they had extra room to collect. And in a few years, that too looked like the home of somebody who might have a slight mental illness. But what she did is that was when she decided she was going to build herself a mansion And she loved Venice. Venice was like one of her favorite places, so she decided she was going to build herself a Venetian palace. And actually, that's what the Gardner Museum is. It's a Venetian palace turned in on itself. So where the garden is in the middle of the museum is actually where, the canals of Venice would have been had you been sitting inside and looking out. And so she built this, and she put all of her paintings in it. And when she died, she lived in it. She lived there until she died. And then she left it to the city of Boston, and it became the Gardner Museum. I understand that a number of you went to the museum as part of this program. And if any of you haven't gone, you really should, because it is one of the most unique museums, if not the most unique museum you're going to see anywhere. Because what it is it's Belle. Her friends called her Belle, and I feel like I know her so well now, I could call her Belle too. She had one child, a little boy who died when he was 2. Which completely broke her heart. She had nervous breakdown years and was never able to have another child. And the armchair psychologists say that perhaps her collection was her child. And so she felt so strongly, talk about helicopter parents, about how everything would be, that everything had to go in a specific place. As you know, the museum, things are not shown in their best light because the lighting is bad, and often she just has different kinds of paintings and sculptures and furniture and rugs just kind of all smooshed together. But that was Belle. This was her, and when she died in her will, she said that nothing could be changed. Nothing could be added, nothing could be subtracted, and nothing was ever to go out on loan. So I was thinking, yeah, I could write about her, and I can write about this, and this is all very cool. But when I started to write it, I just couldn't wrap my head around how to carve out a story from her massive life. So I went back to my file, and I found an article about the greatest art heist in history that just so happened to happen at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And I'm like, yeah, this could really work. I can write something about Belle and something about the heist, and this will all be good. But I couldn't figure out how to tie the heist together, which happened in 1990, as I'm sure most of you know, when 2 bumbling thieves broke into the Gardner Museum, tied up the two guards. They had a very, very minimal security system. And they spent 57 minutes going through the museum and ripping masterpieces out of their frames. They took 13 items, some of them very, very valuable, but they also left like Titian's Europa on the wall. They left lots of valuable things. And then they took a couple of things that were very insignificant. The finial off the top of a Napoleonic flag, a glass beaker, which makes you think that it might have been an amateur heist involved. But it was like this happened in 1990. It did kind of appear to me to be an amateurish thing. And Belle had died in the early 1920s. I couldn't figure out how to link these stories up. So I'm kind of stressing out, and I'm sitting at my computer one day and, just typing things in about art. And you know how sometimes when you're screwing around, you end up on websites that you don't want to be at. And you're like, get me out of here quick. But I stumbled on a website about art forgery, and I was just fascinated by it. Who are these people who forge paintings, and why do they do it, and how do they do it, and what happens when they get caught, or more interesting, what happens when they don't get caught? So I thought, oh, there's got to be something I can do to get art forgery in here too, and link it up, and I can write about all of those things. We had just about this time, we raised our kids in Lexington, and then when our son was a freshman in college, we moved back into the city where we had originally been. And we live in the South End where the book is set. And I've always been very interested in art, and suddenly I was walking distance to all of these fabulous museums and art galleries, and the South End actually has a pretty large art community. And so I started going to all of these places and getting to know people. And I thought, okay, well, maybe the thing that will link all of this together is if I have a character who is in the contemporary art scene in Boston. So I did a whole bunch of research on forgery and on Bell and on the art scene in Boston and on the robbery. And I had, tons of stuff all around me, notes and highlights and books and articles. And you may have heard other authors talk about how they're writing and suddenly the characters jump out of the book and they take over and they go prancing off, and the author's like just hanging on to their coattails and following. Well, this has never happened to me. But I thought, I've got these 4 major pieces. I know all about these people. I figured it all out. Maybe this time it will work. So I set everything up around me on my desk. And I waited. And I waited. Nobody came. So I actually have a PhD in sociology, because all novelists need a PhD in sociology. It's definitely a prereq. But one of the things that my major area of concentration in sociology is statistics. So I decided I would write my novel using statistical methods. So you may not know, but all storylines follow a normal curve. This goes for the storyline, it goes for the character arcs, it goes for all of the subplots, it can even be the progression of some art movement. And each of these normal curves can be broken into the 4 equal parts, and each of the breaks correspond to the 3-act structure of a novel. So I do that. I also use bubblegrams, which are situations and people and how they relate to each other. So like, for example, if Aidan and Claire have to end up together here doing this, back here they had to meet somewhere and something else had to happen that would get them to this place. So I do these big bubblegrams. One of my favorite things that, it's a little weird, but I do love it, I do tension charts for all of my scenes. So for example, in any book, movie, story, there are some things that are lower level tension, because you need them. You need to set something up. You need to give the reader a break from too much tension. And so I assign a tension coefficient to every scene. That slower scene gets a 0.25. If it's starting to get bigger and there's more action and things are starting to really pulse a little bit, that gets a 0.50. If it's really, really, really good and meaty and you envision the reader turning the pages, it gets a 0.75. And if it is a major, major scene, it gets the big 1.0, which corresponds back to those 4 major plot points on the normal curve. I know it's a little weird, but the Shapiro method of novel writing works for me. I'm not sure it would work for anybody else, but it does work for me. So all of this culminates in the most important thing in the Shapiro method of novel writing, And, you know, I don't know if anybody here is a statistician or has training in it, so you're probably not going to understand it, but I'll tell you anyway. I use multicolored file cards. Very sophisticated. So what I do is, so for example, the robbery. I plotted out the major plot points of the robbery, and I took yellow file cards, and each of the main plot points I put on an individual card. Then I took Belle's life, and I wrote out the plot points according to the normal curve, and I took pink file cards, and I moved all of those around. Then I had started to develop Claire, and so she maybe had 20 plot points, and I gave her red file cards, and the same for Aiden, and the same for the art forgers, and all of this. So I ended up with a stack of cards this big of all of these. Now I have to figure out a way to make it all work into a story that works together. So what I do is I take all the cards, and I take a bunch of blank cards, and I set them up on my dining room table and move them around. Also in the same for brackets of the 3-act structure, and I move them around to try and get a story that's going to work. And there's something about the tactile nature of it, also because I have blank ones, and if I don't like one, I just throw it behind me and then scribble a new one and move it around. And then it's really exciting if you have 3 different cards from 3 different stories that all end up with the same event, so they can all be together, and you know that's going to be at least a 0.75 because this is all coming together. And you know, so I'm doing this back and forth, and there's also something about the colors and just looking at the visual of it, and you can see, no, there's too much art forgery here, and you need more Belle here, and you know, playing around with all of it. And the other thing that's really good about it, that I actually like the best, is that I don't like to cook. And we live in a condo in Boston, and the dining room table is the table. And this can take months. This is not a fast process. And they need to stay on the dining room table because I have to look at them, and I walk around the table a few times every day and move it around. So I can't have any dinner parties. And my husband just has to pick up takeout so that we can eat at the breakfast bar for the whole time this is going on. So that's a really big plus. But it helps me conceive of the whole book. And some people just sit down and write, and I find them very, very brave. I'm really a cowardly writer, and I need to know that there's a beginning and a middle and an end before I start, because otherwise I'm afraid I'm just going to paint myself into a corner. So so I had all of this, I had it all worked out, and I took my file cards upstairs, and they were now in chronological order, and I wrote the first draft. Then I had to do a whole nother set of cards because the first draft wasn't exactly right. So I did it all again and wrote the second draft, and then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. I would say that every page of my books have been written at least 20 times, sometimes more. I tell my writing students, if you don't like to rewrite, just go take another class, because that's what writing is all about. So that was what I did, and I wrote, and my writers group thought it was really, really good. They were extremely supportive. They thought it was really good. I gave it to my mother, and she thought it was fabulous. So I knew I was ready to take it to my agent, right? My mother likes it. Woohoo! So I brought it to my agent. My agent didn't like it. But it wasn't that she didn't like it. What she said was that it didn't fit into a genre. And if it didn't fit into a genre, she didn't know how to pitch it to publishers. So I went through 6 or 7 more agents before I found one who acknowledged that, yes, it didn't fit into a genre, but the book was good enough and she was going to go out and do it. So she took it to all of those big publishers in New York, and every single one turned it down. Why? It didn't fit into a genre. And if it didn't fit into a genre, they didn't know how to pitch it to librarians and booksellers. So now you can only imagine how depressed I am. This is just, I've written this book, which I think is really good. My writers group does, and my mother really likes it. So it's, I wrote this great book, and nobody wants it. I'm also really pissed at my husband. What kind of an idea is that? Write a book without a genre? It's like, come on. So I said to my agent, I said, look, just take the book out to anybody you know who might even be remotely interested in publishing it, because otherwise I'm going to have to go back to that career I really didn't want to have. And so it ended up on the desk of an editor at Algonquin Books. And Algonquin has a very different MO from other publishers. The large publishers of Random House, Simon & Schuster, people like that, they publish anywhere between 200, 300, 400 books a month, every month. And they have X number of promotion dollars. And they put probably 90% of all their promotion dollars behind the big names, John Grisham and J.K. Rowling and Stephen King and people like that, because that's where they're going to they know they're going to make their money there. And then they take the next 5%, and that's who supports writers whose names you know. And then the other, 343 books that are coming out that month don't get any promotion at all. And that's why they need books to fit into a genre, because they can sell all of those books. Here are our 10 mysteries. Here are 10 historicals. Here are our 10 romances. Here's this. But a book that doesn't fit into a genre that they don't have money to promote, they can't publish it. And that was why none of them did. And that's also why my original 5 books didn't really get read, because nobody knew about them. But Algonquin Books publishes 12 new titles a year, and they get behind all of their titles. They're very picky. I could not believe they wanted to publish my book. But this editor loved it, and she knew that it didn't fit into a genre, and she believed in the book, and so they said that they would publish it. Well, I mean, you can only imagine what this was like. I mean, it was just incredible. I was so excited and so thrilled, and so I go into New York to meet my editor. And it's this beautiful spring day, kind of like today. And I'm driving in the yellow cab from the train station down to meet my editor, to go to my publisher. I have an editor, I have a publisher. This is all so exciting. And I go in and I meet her, and I meet all the people there, and they're just wonderful. And she takes me out to lunch, and we have a great time. And she says during lunch, she says, we have a lot of books that we publish that make the New York Times bestseller list. And I'm like, oh, cool, I'm getting a little misty-eyed. I have a publisher that has books on the New York Times bestseller list. And then she says, and we're going to do everything we can to put your book on the New York Times bestseller list. I burst into tears. She's like, I'm sure, sitting there going, oh no. And it wasn't that I thought they were going to be able to do it. It was that an editor was actually telling me that they were going to try. And then they went out and they promoted the hell out of the book. And they took the book that nobody thought they could sell, that they didn't know how to pitch, and turned it into a New York Times bestseller. It was unbelievable. The day I got that call, I ran down to the liquor store, got a couple of bottles of champagne, and was running through the neighborhood and knocking on my friends' doors, and, the New York Times. And after that, everything just was amazing. Those first 5 books that were out of print now were available as ebooks and as paperbacks. I didn't have to divorce my husband because suddenly it was a good idea to write a book that didn't fit into a genre, so that was all good. And then I got a contract to write 2 more books for Algonquin. I could not believe I was living the life I was living. I couldn't believe that this had happened after I'm 60 years old and getting my big break. I mean, how often does this happen to a person? And then my first grandchild is born. I was like, really? It's like, talk about pinching yourself. But there was a problem. The problem was that I had taken money to write a book, and I had a deadline, and I didn't know what I was going to write. So I thought, well, people really seem to like the art world. I really liked writing about the art world, and I'll write another book about the art world. And for every book I write, I try to give myself a new challenge. So the challenge for the Art Forger was to write a story with a protagonist who did the wrong thing who people could still relate to. And then for the next book, I decided I would do a full historical. I'd never written a full historical before. And so then I had to figure out, well, where do I want to set the book? They say that you should write what you know. If you've been keeping count, The Muralist is my 11th book, and I ran out of what I know about 10 and a half ago. So I write what I want to learn about. So The Art Forger took me 3 years to write. The Muralist took me 4 years. And if I'm going to hang out that long with a subject and a time and these characters, I better be interested in them. Otherwise, forget it. So I'd always wanted to write a book about the Depression. My parents had grown up during the Depression, and I'd always been really fascinated by the stories they told and the deprivation that they went through, even though they didn't really understand that it was deprivation. And as a sociologist, you talk about nature and nurture, but there's a third category that I've always been really interested in, and that's the moment in time that you ride your life through. All those events that are happening around you that then really make you who you are. So, for example, my mother said that one day she was in her closet and she looked around and she realized that she had a dozen bags, plastic bags, filled with plastic bags. And she had this image of me, the only daughter, going through her clothes after she had died and looking around and going, "Ma, what's with all the plastic bags?" And so she quickly threw them all away. But what they were was a vestige of her childhood in the Depression, when you didn't know where your next plastic bag was going to come from. And so I thought, well, I'll write a book that has the main characters during the Depression, and I'll have it be a woman, and then I'll have a main character in the present who they have a lot of similarities, and see how different it is for their 2 lives. So I started doing a little research, and I found out if you match the Depression with art, you get the WPA, Roosevelt's program to get the country to work during the Depression. And part of the WPA was the FAP, the Federal Art Project, and they hired artists. This is like really hard to believe today. They hired artists, paid them a living wage to create art. And then they took this art and they put it in all the buildings that they were building, the libraries and town halls and everything else that they were building as part of the WPA. And so I thought, this is really cool. I'll write about this. And so I started doing a little more research. And because of my academic training, I know how to do research. But I'm sure there are a couple of academics here today. And when you do academic research, you have to go to every last person who has even breathed on your subject, and you have to cite them and put them in the bibliography. It gets very tedious, one of the reasons I got out of academia. But when you do research for a novel, you just research until you're not interested anymore, and then you make the rest of it up. So I was having a great time with all of this. And I discovered that in New York City in 1939, working for the WPA were a number of very famous artists. Perhaps you've heard of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning was there, Lee Krasner, Hans Hofmann, Gorky. I mean, it was like this amazing moment. And they were all young, and they didn't know they were Pollock and Rothko. They were just, you know, Jack and Mark. And there were a whole bunch of them, and they're like wild and crazy and hanging out together and drinking and smoking pot and jumping in and out of bed with each other. And I thought, I'm going to make all of these people real characters in the book. And then I did a little more research, and it turned out that Eleanor Roosevelt, my very favorite person in all of history, was very involved in the WPA Federal Art Project that she had actually instigated and tried to get this as part of the WPA. And she was involved, and she would go down to where they were painting murals. So these artists were doing individual pieces, and they were doing murals, and they were doing sculptures, and they were doing paintings and graphics, all kinds of stuff. But she had her heart in the murals. And so I thought, I'm going to make her a character. And I did more investigation into her, and I found out that on her deathbed, she told her son that the greatest regret in her life was that she had not forced Franklin to let in more refugees from Europe before World War II. And I'm thinking, there's a really interesting story here. Why would somebody this powerful with her kind of empathy and sensitivities, and you know, I thought Roosevelt was pretty empathetic to this cause, why wouldn't she have been able to do it? And it turns out that there were people who you may also have heard of who were standing in her way. Very powerful men, Charles Lindbergh, Joe Kennedy, and a man called Breckinridge Long. And Breckinridge Long was Assistant Secretary of State to Roosevelt, and he was in charge of visas. And the visas had already been approved by Congress, and the refugees had already been vetted in Europe, and his job was just to match them up. That was all he had to do. But he was an isolationist and an anti-Semite, and we now know that he personally kept 200,000 refugees, most of them Jewish, from coming into this country, and we know what happened to them. So I'm like, I'm gonna get this guy. I'm gonna get him. So I had my bad guy, and I had the politics, and then I had the development of the movement of abstract expressionism, which is really what Pollock and Rothko and Krasner all did. And so I came up with these characters, and I had a mystery. The main character, you find out in the first chapter, mysteriously disappears while trying to get her family visas to get them out of France after coming into opposition with Joe Kennedy and Charles Lindbergh and Breckinridge Long. So this book took me 4 years to write, and I didn't have to find an editor because I already had one, so that was really good. And we reworked it, and it came out in hardback in 2015, paperback in 2016. And I'm just finishing up another book. It's also about art, and it takes place in the 1920s in Philadelphia and Paris. And all of these artists and literary people are hanging out in Gertrude Stein's salon, and you know, it's just really good. And I created this con man who I think is the best character I've ever created. I just love him. He's so awful. And so this book too, as those two, have, you know, there's a mystery. It's historical. It is about art, and it has some romance in it. In The Art Forger, maybe Belle had a relationship with Degas. In The Muralist, the protagonist does have an affair with Mark Rothko. And in my new book, excuse me, in my new book, the protagonist has an affair with Henri Matisse. So I guess what I have done is that I have created my own genre of history, mystery, romance, and art novels. And I suppose you could say that the bottom line of this long story I have been telling you is that after 25 years in the trenches, I am an overnight success. Thank you. And I'll be happy to take any questions. I'm going to call on you. You know, I know you have questions. All right, you don't have to come up to the microphone, okay?
You just stand.
One is, if you had a moment with Isabella Stewart character, what would you ask her? You had one question. And the other is, what pieces are from the heist you missed the most? Well, the second part of, I guess I could just do it like this. The second question is much easier to answer. Vermeer's The Concert is, I used to go to the museum just to see that painting. Vermeer only painted, I think, 20 paintings or something like that, very, very few, and he was such a master of light. Just unbelievable. So that's definitely the one I miss the most, and just hope that someday it will come back. I think, what would I ask Belle? I think I'd ask her if she loved her husband, because I've always been curious about that. Well, yeah, I would like to know that. Who else? Yes. I'm sorry? So the question is, does Belle have any relatives in Boston, and did I track any of them down? She actually doesn't, because she didn't have any children, and although she did raise, so John's brother and his wife died, and they raised 3 of his brother's sons, so they're still around. But nobody wanted to talk to me about any of this, and the Gardner Museum wouldn't talk to me. I made the mistake of, when I first started writing the book, I went to the Gardner and I said, I'm writing a book about the heist. And they're like, this was, 10 years ago. And they've opened up a lot more now, but they said, no, we are not, this is our tragedy. You are not going to write about it. When the book came out, it was just when they were opening up the new exhibit and the new edition. And so my publisher called and said, this would be a great opportunity, to do. And they're like, no, we will have nothing to do with her. We will have nothing to do with her book. It is, our tragedy, and you're trying to make money off of it, and we don't want to have anything to do with it. So, which I was not surprised at. My publisher was very surprised. But about a year later, I get a call from my sales rep, and she says, guess who just put a big order in for your book? It was the Gardner, because what was happening, and all these people were reading the book and then going to the Gardner. And, I had created this huge amount of traffic for them, and then people wanted the book to be there. And so they were forced to order it. I have not heard from anybody. And the same, so in The Muralist, Mark Rothko, who does have kids who are very active, and he's the main character, and he's cheating on his wife and all this stuff. I thought I might hear from them, but I haven't. So it's interesting, when you do this kind of historical research. I know a lot of historical novelists, and some people want every single fact to be true. Some people, I was on a panel with this woman who writes, some kind of Victorian romance, and she said, all I care about are the clothes. It's like, and then I'm somewhere more in the middle, a little bit closer towards the fact part. But as we say in my writers group, you cannot let the truth get in the way of a good story. So that's why I fiddle around with these things that might or might not anger some people. So far, most of the people who I write about, so like Mark Rothko, for example, Mark Rothko had a very rocky marriage, and he did have an affair. Obviously, he didn't have an affair with Alizé Benoit, who is a fictional character. But he did have affairs, which is why I chose him to be the person that she would have the affair with. So, could they sue me? I suppose, but nobody has. So I guess that's good. Of course, they say any publicity is good, so it generates some good publicity. Who else? Yes.
How long have you been in a writer's group, and has it been the same group all along, and how did it start?
So the question is about my writer's group, which has a long evolution. We started after I wrote my first novel that I didn't even mention that didn't get published, because nobody's first novel ever gets published. After I wrote my first novel, I realized that perhaps I needed to take a writing class, seeing as how I didn't have any degrees in English and didn't really know what I was doing. So I took a writing class, a novel writing class, at the Cambridge Center for Adult Ed, and in that class I met 4 other people. And we decided after the class to start a writer's group. None of us, this was a beginning class in novel writing at an adult education center. None of us, we all had come from different walks of life. None of us knew how to write a novel. We formed a writer's group, and so a few people came in and out, but pretty much for the first 15 years, there were 4 of us. And we taught each other how to write novels. And just this year, the last person to get a novel published got her novel published. And between the 4 of us, we have 16 published novels, traditionally published, not self-published novels, from nothing. Unfortunately, what happened is people had to get jobs or they moved away and things, and so now my writers group has 2 people in it. But we still work the same way. We still critique the hell out of each other's stuff. We brainstorm. As a matter of fact, in the acknowledgments to the muralist, the woman that in my writers group, or is my writers group's name is Jan Brogan. And in the acknowledgments, I wrote, "To Jan, I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you." And that's the way we feel. Anybody who's thinking of writing a novel, I would say getting a writers group is one of the best things that I would suggest. They're hard and they don't always work, but when they work, and also, you're getting critiqued, but you're also critiquing other people. And when you critique other people, you see that they're doing some of the same things you're doing that you hadn't noticed you were doing. It's like, oh, yeah, right. That's going on too long. So you got to cut it down. But I would highly recommend a writer's group for anybody. Anybody else? Yes.
Are you going to stick with this art general or something else?
Well, this will, with the new one, which will probably be out fall of 2018, I'll have my trilogy of art history, mystery, romance books. So I have an idea to do something very, very different, which is scary to me. I also have another idea that might be, it wouldn't be art, it would be it would be historical and has all these other things, which would be easier, but I have a feeling I'm going to go and do the really hard one because I'm just a masochist, right? If you haven't learned that from this story, then you haven't been listening to me. Who else? Yes.
What were your 5 other careers, and what led you to kind of go the road of writing?
So the question is about my 5 other careers and how I got into writing from them. Well, as I said, I'm a sociologist, and my first few years out of graduate school, I ran research projects, primarily that had to do with my first job, which is really very interesting, is I was running a research project on a substance abuse, a treatment facility for poor minority women with children. And the feds were funding this research. And I did that and a couple of other things like that for a few years. And then the administration changed, and I knew there wasn't going to be money for the kinds of things I was interested in. So I went back to my statistics, and I got a job as a statistician, and that turned into a job as a systems analyst. And then when I was doing that, I got recruited to run the Boston office of a software development company. And I also had been teaching sociology at Tufts at that time. And so I got married, and I had a kid, and, you know, everything was great. And then I had a second kid. And I was running this Boston office, and I was traveling all the time, and I had a lot of responsibility, and I just said, Superwoman is dead. Interestingly, the title of my first novel that never got published, Superwoman is Dead. And so I was actually having lunch with my mother one day, and I said, I don't know what to do. If I'm not Superwoman, then who am I? And she looked at me, and she said, she asked me a question. And she said, if you had 1 year to live, what would you do? And I said, I would write a novel and spend more time with my children. And that's what I did. And I haven't been, although there were many moments I was sorry, overall I haven't been sorry at all. And then there was that working spouse with benefits who did allow it all to happen, but I have a son who's a filmmaker who's out in LA, and I keep telling him, get that working spouse with benefits, come on. It'll really help you a lot. Do it. Who else? Yes. You know, I don't think I ever gave that to her. Oh, the other ones? Yeah, she's my mother, you know. But she felt very differently about the art forger. I mean, like, she had always liked them, and my parents are very supportive, and fortunately, they're still alive, so they lived long enough to see, you know, me become an overnight success, and a lot of it was because of them, because they were so supportive of me doing whatever it was that I really wanted to do. So it was great. Anybody else? Nobody wants to know my theory on the heist? I never do a talk about the art forger where somebody doesn't ask me that. I have really not very good theory on the heist. So I did a lot of research and talked to a lot of people, obviously read all kinds of stuff. And so the heist happened in 1990. So we're going on 27 years, and not a single piece has been found. There have been like hundreds of thousands of hours of interviews and you know, all over the world. The Boston police, the FBI, Interpol, the Gardner Museum. I mean, it's still going on. They still have people working full time on this, and no one has found anything. A lot of people think it was the mafia, but I don't think so, because I think that if it had been the mafia, somebody would have spilled some beans somewhere. You know, it just, you know, I don't know any more than anybody else knows, and clearly nobody knows, but it just doesn't feel right to me. There was a guy who was a guard that night, and he was a musician and kind of a wild guy, and he admitted that he was stoned every night that he was at the museum. And there were rumors that he had told people, in his musical, he was a young guy in his 20s, in his musical circle, that it would be really easy to steal paintings out of the Gardner Museum because there was, the security system was barely there. They had never really thought that, they thought of themselves as a small museum. They never really thought it would ever happen. And the night before, they found this, they didn't find this out until quite a bit later, but the night before the heist, he was on duty and had opened the door. So the way the museum was, there's the entrance door was on the side of, it's a pretty major spot in Boston. It's right near Northeastern and the MFA, but it's not super busy. But the night before, he had opened that door for a little while and then closed it. There weren't surveillance cameras, so they don't know what exactly happened. It was just tripped because the door went open. And that's the door that they came in the next day. He was tied up and didn't, it wasn't found till the next day, but they were unhurt. Nobody hurt him. And what happened during the robbery is, so these two guys who are dressed as police officers, but their uniforms are like uniforms that you would rush out and buy your son the day of Halloween because he got invited to a party. They were like really, really bad uniforms. And they went through the museum, taking things that were valuable, leaving things that were valuable, taking things that weren't valuable. And then we now know that they went back and forth twice, carrying the artwork, put it in they carried some of it out, went back to the museum, carried the rest of it out, and put it into the back of this rusted out old Datsun hatchback and drove away. Never seen anything again. I think that it was done as a lark. That's what they just decided it would be kind of fun to do. Maybe they were all stoned. And that then these guys turned around as they're driving away. They look in the back of the car and they say, oh shit, now what do we do? And I worry that they did something bad to them. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully, either some guy is sitting with them all in his basement, or somebody is using them as collateral on the drugs or arms market, because then they would have to be taking care of them. So that's my hope, but my theory isn't all that hopeful. Although there have been a number of instances where stolen artwork was found decades later. So it's, the Gardner Museum is sure they'll get them back. I'm just not as sure. So if nobody has any more questions, I'll be happy to sign books or answer questions that you have that you don't want to ask in front of everybody. And I just want to thank you all very, very much for coming and being such a great audience. Thank you.